Today in the modern world, when we want to head out into the wilderness, maybe go for a bushwalk or to go hunting, we have a lot of modern technology at our disposal. There are a lot of well-established tracks in this day and age, but even when you want to go off track, we have things like modern GPS devices, even our phones, and detailed topographical maps. But I like to think about those people who went out into the wilderness with none of this modern technology and how they get by. Now, I love going out into the bush and I do use this modern technology quite often, but I also like to experiment and try to use some of the methods that the old timers used to use. Now, I recently did a big hike at Wilson's Prom on the northern circuit, and a lot of it was wild and off track with, the trail basically overgrown and no more. And I was using my GPS device for that. And it made me think, what about the old timers? How did they get by? How did they navigate in this vast wilderness, from the Indigenous and then to the European explorers along the coastline and also inland? And what about the bushworkers? What about the swagmen or the stockmen or the miners or the loggers or the hunters, even the bushrangers? How did they get by without this modern technology? And how did they navigate in the vast Australian wilderness? That's what I want to look at in this video. My country of Australia holds vast wilderness that is very easy to get lost in. From the rugged coastlines with thick, dense heathland, to the river basins where rivers stretch for kilometres and kilometres, winding and snaking through the countryside, to the high country with rugged mountain ranges and unpredictable weather, the endless forests, from the dry, scrubby bushland to temperate ferny forests and the dense tropical rainforests. And then the much loved but dangerous outback, boundless tracts of land where water is scarce. How did people navigate this landscape before modern cities were built and modern technology helped us chart the land? We have many accounts of Bushmen dying out in the Australian wilderness who got lost. Famous explorer Ludwig Leichhardt disappeared when attempting to cross the continent from east to west in 1848. Did his party lose their way and perish as a result? In 1896, a lost swagman's body was found alongside the overland telegraph line, and it is assumed the man lost his way and perished in the harsh wilderness. A newspaper illustrator named Walker Hodgson illustrated this picture of the event and labelled it "Bushed, Australia's Horror." Clearly getting lost and perishing in the bush was a horror that the colonists and settlers dreaded. But many Indigenous had been navigating this harsh wilderness before them, and the Europeans also had their own unique ways to navigate this landscape. Now, before European settlement in the country, we had the Indigenous. The Indigenous were migrating and settling into areas for thousands of years, and they had a very intimate knowledge of the land, and they were obviously navigating through this wilderness for a long, long time. You would have separate groups would come and they would settle in an area, into a distinct area, and their knowledge of that area would be incredibly intimate, and they would know all the landmarks, all the features, all the navigational routes of that distinct specific area. Now, my focus on the channel is predominantly European heritage in this country, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about the Indigenous ways of navigation in the bush, just because I don't feel like I am much of an authority to be able to teach on that, and I much prefer to recommend people to other content creators who have more knowledge in that area. But from what I have learned, there were some distinct ways that they would often navigate, and one of those was what is called song lines. Now, from my knowledge, these are songs that were passed down from generation to generations, and they were basically traveling songs that were sung as they were traveling along, and the songs themselves would talk about specific landmarks and features that they could use to navigate as they were walking through the countryside. Now, the Indigenous were much more oral and verbal in their way of navigating with storytelling, as opposed to the European method, which was much more based on written accounts and charting and scientific kind of map writing. The Indigenous also had seasonal trails that were used from year to year. You know, when they navigated down to the coastline in the summer, they would use those seasonal trails, or when they went up into the mountains, they would use these seasonal trails. So when the early Europeans first came here, they did notice that there was a lot of footpaths and foot trails that were already in operation from Indigenous tribes during the day. So the first European navigation of the Australian coastline didn't actually go to the British. First, the Portuguese and the French and the Dutch all explored parts of the Australian coastline before the English ever got there. And that's why we have names like Van Diemen's Land for Tasmania. But it really was the British who filled in the gaps, so to speak, when it came to chart mapping of the Australian coastline. In 1770, Captain James Cook charted much of the east coast of Australia using both a combination of celestial observations and longitude and latitude calculations. This was done carefully calculating the positions of things like the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars. And instruments like the sextant were often used to measure the distance between a body and the horizon. Captain James Cook also charted many of the freshwater streams along the coastline and filled them in on his maps, which was very useful later on to the First Fleet. European navigation was very much instrument-based and very methodical, and it's amazing to see old maps of the time and how accurate they actually are to the modern maps we have today. They really did an amazing job charting the coastline. Now, Matthew Flinders was one of our best naval explorers, and with his good friend George Bass, the surgeon, they explored much of the southern coastline of Australia and what is now known as Bass Strait. Matthew Flinders also circumnavigated the whole of Australia, the Australian coastline, during 1801 to 1803. Historical records also show that Matthew Flinders used devices like chronometers, which helped in calculating longitude more precisely. In his journal, Voyage to Terra Australis from 1801 to 1803, Matthew Flinders has this to say: "The longitude was obtained by a mean of the timekeepers, and the latitude by meridian observations with the sextant." We can also see that Matthew Flinders took depth soundings and used compasses in other parts of his journals here. The soundings were from 6 to 10 fathoms. The bearings of the land were taken with compass and the angles measured. To think that Matthew Flinders and also George Bass completed many of their journeys in various sized wooden whale boats out here on the Bass Coast, where it is rough, stormy and wild, is really incredible to think these guys were really heroes of coastal exploration in Australia. When the Europeans started settling along the coast, there was a push to go into the interior to see what was there. They wanted to open up the interior for stock grazing. And so this is when the explorers and the land surveyors came into play. So often pushing inland, both on foot and on horseback, they would cut through the landscape, cutting tracks through the bush, walking along mountain ranges, and basically trying to find the best path through the landscape. They would create rough maps using both compasses and observing the landmarks in the area to survey the landscape. In Edward John Eyre's Journals of Expeditions of Discoveries, published in 1845, he wrote this about crossing the Nullarbor: "We steered by compass nearly northwest, guided also by the general direction of the coast." Many of the explorers also hired and used Indigenous trackers. These were native people to a local area who understood the landscape very well. They could direct them to water and across mountain ranges. They had also often travelled into neighbouring tribal areas and had a general understanding of the surrounding landscapes. And they were incredibly useful and helpful to those first explorers. Again, Edward John Eyre talks about his Indigenous companion, Wiley, and he writes this: "To Wiley I am indebted for great assistance. His quickness in discovering water was of the utmost service." And then we see the explorer, Major Mitchell, writing this: "Our guide led us by paths known only to the natives." So a word here must be given to the Afghan cameleers. Now, the explorers predominantly used horses in the beginning, but as they started pushing into the vast interior of the outback, camels started to be preferred. And so the Afghan cameleers were the best at training the camels and handling the camels and using these camels, because camels were quite efficient at going long distances in harsh desert landscapes, much better than horses. And so they used these camels to carry essential supplies like barrels of water to help keep them alive. And it was the Afghan cameleers who were in charge of those camels. So not only did they hire Indigenous guides, but they also hired Afghani cameleers. Now, not all of them were Afghanis. There were quite a few who were also from what's modern day Pakistan and modern day India today as well. But these men were exceptional at working with the camels, and they were very highly utilized by the early explorers. Now, the Calvert expedition had a cameleer called Bajar, who was noted to be an exceptional worker. Bajar managed the camels and provided an excellent camel team. And so the interior was opened up. Notable explorers also used things like wooden dinghies and wooden whale boats to navigate down rivers, like the famous Charles Sturt did, both down the Darling River and also down the Murray River. Now, this was a great way to navigate through the landscape, obviously, because you didn't have to cut a track. In a narrative of the expedition into Central Australia, published in 1847, Charles Sturt writes this: "We followed the windings of the river, taking bearings at every considerable reach." We know Sturt also used the sextant while inland in the Outback, because he also writes this in his journal: "The latitude was determined by meridian altitude." From the mid-1800s, the interior of Australia was starting to be settled. And so a lot of bush huts and little farm homesteads like this started to appear out in wild places. Now, there was a lot of workers out in the bush and in the rural areas during this time, and they would often travel through the bush from townships to townships looking for work, and they had a variety of methods to be able to navigate through our wilderness. At this point, there was already a lot of track networks going on. So pastoral routes and stock routes that were reused over and over again each year turned into well-formed trails and even into roads eventually, cutting through mountainous areas and through the landscape. And so Bushmen would often use these well-formed tracks. You hear of the Australian swagmen. Well, they used to use old country roads to get from townships to townships, or they'd cut through wilderness areas, usually on old stock routes as well. Now, word of mouth was often common, hearing from people what direction to take. Local guides, native guides were still used during this time, and even settlers who were very experienced and lived in the area for a long time. Their knowledge, their first-hand knowledge was very essential for these Bushmen to use. You know, out in rural Australia, asking for directions has a long history in our country, and in a way, rural folk really needed to rely on each other to be able to survive. Knowing where the next waterhole is and if there's going to be water there, and asking a local settler that information could be the difference between life or death. So rough, rudimentary maps were in operation during this time. More so, you might get it on a pastoral station where the stockmen would use these rough maps, knowing where the local boundaries of the pastoral station is, where the features like waterholes are, that they can find them. So rudimentary rough maps were in the making at the time and could be copied from hand to hand, though it wasn't a predominant method for the Bushmen to use as they travelled. Following fence lines was a good way to get around. You know that if you stuck to the fence, you were going to be on the outskirts of civilizations, and pastoral runs, especially in the late 1800s and early 1900s when barbs started going up. A long barbed wire fence could be travelled along and you can find your direction that way. I've actually done that myself out in the Outback on an old pastoral fence line, and I knew that if I stick to this fence, I should be okay. Now, all these methods are also how bushrangers used to get around as well. But the thing about bushrangers is bushrangers kind of took prominence in the area that they grew up in. You know, they were called the natives. So the term the natives was first used originally for the Indigenous, but British people who came and settled in Australia often called the children of British immigrants or settlers who had been born in Australia, they were also called natives. So a lot of bushrangers were what you called the native Australians, or the native British people, you could say, who were born and grew up in Australia. So they had a deep, intimate knowledge of the landscape around them. They knew all the trails, they knew all the mountain ranges, they knew how to get around very, very well. And that's often why police could not actually catch them, because they were just very, very hardy bushmen, very, very knowledgeable of their landscape, and very, very capable out in the wilderness. And so as a result of that, we also see the Indigenous trackers. To track down a bushranger or a lost person, we do see police forces starting to hire Indigenous people to be able to track for them, just because, you know, they were the best bet they had to be able to counter the knowledge of some of these bushrangers. The New South Wales Police History Archives actually has a statement in it saying this: "The Aboriginal tracker was invaluable in locating lost persons and following trails invisible to Europeans." And then in the 1850s came the gold miners. These guys pushed into the new frontier and they were the new explorers of the day. Yes, in the 1850s, gold was found in Australia and a big wave of immigration came into the country, and these people would often go out into the wilderness, into these new frontiers, and they paved the way as the new explorers, and they had to navigate the bush as well. In 1852, a James Bonwick had a publication come out called Notes of a Gold Digger, and in it he has this about navigating in the bush. "By all means, however, provide yourself with good stout clothes and boots. A pack horse will ease the toil." He also shares his experience of being lost here. "I had the satisfaction, when coming down, to be lost in this quarter, wandering about hungry and tired nearly all night." Now, gold diggers would also specifically follow larger rivers upstream and then follow the little tributaries that flowed into it, into the valleys, looking for gold, and they navigated the landscape this way. In fact, this is how Ned Stringer found gold in what is now known as Walhalla today. He had a party who was going up the Thompson River and looking up the tributaries that flowed into the Thompson River, and here in Stringer's Creek, named after him, he found a rich deposit of alluvial gold, and this would become one of the largest gold mining towns in Victoria's history. And so the gold miners really played a part as well in opening up the frontier, and they had to navigate through the bush as well. And so these miners and explorers opened up the country of Australia as they were seeking their fortune, rather in gold or in work, or maybe in finding a new discovery that would make them famous. We still have horse riding tours up in the high country that use old stock routes that the pastoralists used to use. And we should also think about those explorers who pushed both inland and also navigated along our rough coastline before there was any major civilizations there. The Indigenous as well, for thousands of years navigated through the bush. Who knows what roads we're driving on today that originally was a seasonal footpath for some Indigenous tribes. It's fascinating to think about. What I love about Australia today is that there is still vast amounts of wilderness where you can get out there and get a little bit of a taste of what the old timers went through and the traditional Bushmen. And sometimes I think it's good to get out there without a bunch of modern gear and really try and experience it that way. So if you've liked this video, there will be plenty more educational videos on Australian bush history coming out this year. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me what your favourite navigational way was for the old timers that you've learnt about. Otherwise, thank you for watching this video, everyone. Have a good one.